Our opening reading today comes from a longer work by Naomi Shihab called Red Brocade. We read this poem and the one that's later in the service as we visited areas where human remains had been found in the Sonoran Desert. The Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is, where he's come from, where he's headed. That way, he'll have strength enough to answer, or by then you'll be such good friends you don't care. Let's go back to that. Rice, pine nuts. Here, take the red brocade pillow. My child will serve water to your horse. This service is designed for those of us who went on a Borderlinks immersion about immigration seminar in Tucson, Arizona in the beginning of April. This expedition started as a project that the Congregational Church received a grant from its national denomination to fund, and Pat Rathman heard about it and asked if they would like a couple of Unitarians to come, and it turned out that Pat and Dwayne and I joined a group of 15 people, which included 2 8-year-old girls, a grown-up adult, an adult grandson of one of the members, and 12 other community members. Borderlinks is an organization that seeks to educate people on the many complex issues around immigration, particularly on our southern border. Their website says this: the reality of life on the borderlines is much more complex and unjust than most people realize. Borderlinks offers experiential learning opportunities that explore the difficulties of migration and life along the U.S.-Mexico border. We aim to educate individuals through interactive experiences. Their goal is to answer 3 major questions. Why do people migrate? What happens during the migrant journey? And how do policies impact real people? I'd like to introduce the representatives who are here today to help us with this service and share their reflections on their Borderlinks experiences. Please stand as I say your name. Pat Rathman, of course, we all know and love. Pat's contribution to the service is that she's prepared some postcards and addresses of congressmen and legislators so that if you feel inspired to speak up on this issue, she'll make it easy for you. Look for a table downstairs at coffee. Mary Carloy, there she is, okay. Suzanne Kopensakwa, and her daughter Priska, one of our kids. Jen Hackman, Jan Hill, Herb Hill, who's graciously helped us to make the pictures possible today. We will share with you our personal reflections of 5 of our many experiences. Thank you for coming to listen and learn.
Our first full day at Borderlinks began early on a Wednesday morning, April 3rd, when our delegation headed south in 2 vans from Tucson, about 30 miles along Interstate 19. A short way off the freeway, we drove into the yard of the home of 2 women, both members of the Green Valley Swaharita Samaritans. Here we met Randy Meyer, the minister of a United Church of Christ church in Tucson, who would be leading us on a walk in the desert that morning. Randy was a founding member of the Samaritans, an organization dedicated to providing humanitarian aid to migrants crossing the desert and to preventing their death in the desert. The need for aid was made very clear when we were shown a map of the immediate area surrounding the house. It was sprinkled with a large number of red dots, each dot showing where the remains of an unfortunate migrant had been found. To prepare for the hike, we were reminded of the need to take water. And then, a bit surprisingly, we were each issued pocket combs to have along. As probably each of us discovered, the combs were an essential tool to dislodge the potato-sized pieces of cholla cactus that clung to our pants leg on several occasions. The warning not to use our hands became clear when we saw the inch-long spikes pointing in every direction, radiating from this hunk of cholla clinging to our pants legs. I believe I used my comb at least 3 times. It was very important. As Randy pointed out, everything here is out to get you. Our goal that morning was to have a personal understanding of the difficulties and dangers of a trek across the Sonoran Desert, an alternative route taken with increased frequency because of recent extensions of the border wall to the west. At 3 places along the hike, we came across grave markers of people, unknown people of course, who had died on their journey as they attempted to escape the poverty and violence in their home countries. We honored their memory with moments of silence and spoken poems. At the end of our two-hour hike in mild April weather, in daylight hours, and mostly along established trails, we now had a much better understanding of the hardships and perils that would be faced in a walk of many miles over several days in temperatures of 100 degrees and across rugged, unfamiliar terrain. There would be little hope to carry sufficient water. In our 2 hours, I went easily, even in fairly cool weather, through my quart of water. Several organizations are now placing water jugs in the desert, including No More Deaths, a partner organization of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. Astonishingly, several members of No More Deaths are currently awaiting trial for the crime of littering, namely leaving bottles of water in the desert to save lives. At the end of our desert walk, we said goodbye to Randy and continued south in the vans to Nogales. First Arizona, and of course directly across the wall is the Mexican side. On the Arizona side, we had our first look at the wall as it snaked up and over a nearby hillside. A few months ago, I think it was in November somewhere, I'd read about the installation of razor wire along the wall. And I assumed it would be along the top of the wall, but I was so wrong. There are, in fact, 6 rows of razor wire extending from ground level to the top of the 20-foot high wall. Last February, this last February, a couple months ago, the City Council of Nogales, Arizona, condemned the installation, describing the razor-sharp wire as lethal and inhuman. At the border crossing, we were met by Manuel Morales, a resident of Nogales, Mexico, who has been working with Borderlinks for several years. We parked the vans just below a tall, steep cliff with the border wall looming ominously straight overhead. It was here, at this very location, in October of 2012, that a Border Patrol agent shot and killed 16-year-old Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, firing his rifle some 14 to 16 times from a gate high in the wall. Jose was hit in the back 10 times as he tried to run. The border agent claimed he was in danger of rocks being thrown and was acquitted in a trial that ended just this last November. You may have read about it. Being at the site of this tragedy, we could see the impossibility of danger from a rock thrown so far upward toward the wall. The agent could have simply stepped behind the wall in perfect safety. None of us in the delegation to Borderlinks will ever forget the feelings and understandings that we encountered in the Sonoran Desert and along the wall at Nogales. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday. So Mary and I are here to speak of the wall and kind of the environmental impact of the physical barrier on mainly the animal life in the Sonoran Desert. Okay. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, and the Lord God took the man and put him unto the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. So this particular verse in Genesis uses the word dress or till and keep. In Hebrew, the words are abad and shamar. Abad meaning to subject oneself as a servant to God and earth. The other verb, shamar, means to keep, guard, observe, to give heed. Heeding or listening to the earth, not dominating the earth. In the same verb, that same verb is also used for keeping the Sabbath. Leah Shad, a Lutheran minister and seminary professor, writes, thus we can deduce that humans are to regard earth as holy, just as the seventh day is to be revered and respected as holy. We had the pleasure of meeting Miles Traffigen. He's the Borderlands program coordinator for the Wildlands Network. The goal of this particular program is to ensure that endemic species, jaguars, black bears, Sonoran, pronghorn, and Mexican wolves in particular, can move freely through northern Mexico and the southwestern United States. Political boundaries are meaningless to such species, and these natural pathways have long preceded human check stations and border walls. The current wall is 700 miles long and growing, and most of the barriers are made to be impenetrable to humans, but also animals. And most of the border sections are concentrated in urban areas, but the current administration is trying to fill in the gaps and to further and further push wall segments away from urban areas and more into this critical habitat. The photos that Miles showed us really just didn't make any sense from the perspective of a hydrologist, a civil engineer, an ecologist, an economist. In Santa Ana, Texas, for example, there was a wall segment that literally it went right through the Rio Grande River. It doesn't make sense. It's a waterway. You should not build a physical structure right through the river. As a result of this segment of the wall, the river diverted its path, and there was a hole in the this preserved land. There was a whole section downriver that was completely eliminated from water, and so a lot of those species died. And namely, he was talking about the bison that freely travel through this area. Bison can't jump. They can't jump over a wall. Even pronghorn, they really can't physically jump over a wall. So these segments that could be 30 feet high, brightly lit, are going to have severe damage, not only on the migratory patterns of species, but also, nocturnal creatures. So when we talk about policy, there are lots and lots and lots of federal waivers, more than 48 congressional actions that have been passed, and those who are building the wall are not subject to any of these congressional actions. So Miles showed us the list. There are lots of acts, laws, executive orders from the past 100 years enacted by our federal government that construction companies are exempt from. An NPR reporter, Matthew Schwartz, in February wrote, the Trump administration was within its rights to waive dozens of environmental laws to fast-track some border construction projects in Southern California. A federal appeals court has ruled. The Department of Homeland Security said in 2017 it would bypass various environmental regulations, including the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, to quickly construct barriers and roads along the border. And this is along the US-Mexico border, but these construction companies and wall segments, that does not necessarily, that also pertains to the northern border. And so the space between the border and up to 100 miles south is all within the exemption from border construction companies and these environmental laws. So this new policy of building walls, having construction companies exempt from such policy by former Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen finds it necessary to quickly complete security projects. So it's all in the basis of security. And more deeply, a lot of these laws were coming from the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996 under the Clinton administration. So the policy that we're seeing today has been built upon previous administrations. I think to kind of keep it short, our memories, my personal memories of the walk through the desert was really a juxtaposition of images. We would be walking kind of almost right through someone's backyard with a house, a ranch-style house and a pool. You face one way and then you turn the other way and you see a hare running through the desert and these cactuses that are probably 50 years old. So it's definitely La Frontera, this idea, it's a border not only of policy and humanitarianism, but it's the border between people and environment. And I think through this trip and the experiential learning, it was a wonderful experience, and ultimately to witness and to observe what's going on in Arizona and in Tucson is just very, very powerful. And what we're seeing out in the newspapers and the public, that too has makes our journey that much more powerful.
I'm Mary Carloy, and because this is a group organized and sponsored through the United Church of Christ in Pullman, and including people from this church, I've been asked, where have you experienced God or the sacred reality in this Borderlinks week? I found my response to be, I see God in the compassion and the love and the work by so many people in so many ways, trying to help people who are suffering injustice and trying to prevent disastrous environmental effects from the proposed expansion of the wall. The Wild Lions Network presenter that Suzanne talked about was passionate about that group's work to document the animals and their pathways through the borderlands areas. Counting the quantities and mapping the corridors is not easy work by any means. Preserving the pathways for the animals and valuing the variety of creatures is at the heart of it. I see this as a parallel for the necessity of preserving our human connectivity and valuing all the variety of people within our human family. The wall that divides the natural environment divides us, each from the other, as well. Personally, I believe there's the imprint of the sacred within each of us. From the volunteers working to bring comfort in the migrant shelter, you'll hear more about that, to the organizers of help for those who are victimized, to the groups like Wildlands Network dedicated to saving our ecosystem, I saw love and care and passion for what is right. That, to me, was the experience of God in our midst.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer. I'm going to talk to you about Operation Streamline and End Streamline. And for those of you who are also already feeling like this is kind of intense, we went through it from 7 a.m. to about 8 p.m. every day for about 3 days. It was really intense. Thursday afternoon, we entered the courtroom of Honorable Leslie A. Bowman and sat down. There were 10 people already there in shackles. And as court began, those 10 people were called and all approached, at which time the judge immediately went kind of assembly line style to each person, telling them, you know, the details of how they had been stopped, some of them just the day prior, asking if they understood the charges against them and how they pled. And so in that manner, 20 seconds at a time, around 73 people, all of them named here, received quote-unquote justice. For 2 hours, we sat there as she very politely, very civilly, very deftly delivered criminal, misdemeanor, or felony sentences to all of them, making their dreams of being reunited with family, or escaping gangs or violence, or making a little bit of money to send back home pretty much all but impossible. Even people seeking asylum who were found in the desert were given sentences. Keep in mind that for re-entry, it's a felony with up to 180 days in prison, so we saw some people get prison sentences at that time. And so this is Operation Streamline, which is the group prosecution that was begun in 2005. On paper, it is meant to deter immigrants, and that decision to make being in the U.S. a crime in the first place wasn't always the way. For the longest time, people just flowed in and out of the border region, mostly coming over for work and then returning back home. But in 1996, that was made a crime, prior to which it was a civil offense, kind of a catch and release. By 1997, there were 15,000 people charged with criminal misdemeanors. Last year, through March alone, there were 37,000 people who were charged with federal criminal prosecutions at a time when immigration was overall down. And in April of that year, the Attorney General issued a zero-tolerance policy that required each U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute all DHS referrals of illegal entry violations. So we had met with Lois Martin, who is with End Operation Streamline earlier in the day. And she told us that while in detention, defendants don't get showers, they don't really get good meals, we give them food that they don't really eat, so they get sick. And so each would have met with a lawyer for about 15 minutes before attending this trial. And the personal stories all come out. I mean, we were sitting there so far away from them that it was hard, you know, we weren't really interacting with them. All I could see were, you know, the looks on some of their faces, which, you know, there were of course some light moments, but also some really pained expressions as well. And I don't know their personal stories, but there are many people in Tucson who do. And Lois, when we talked about who are these people, Lois recounted a story of how 7 men who had gone together, you know, escaping their country, had gone miles and miles, and they get to the U.S. and they come across this unconscious woman who is near death. And without thinking about it, they picked her up, they went and walked 2 more miles to turn themselves all in to border security so that they could save her life. So one of the hardest things to deal with as you're watching this go on is the recognition of your own privilege and your own ignorance. Because I knew if I'd run into any of those men smaller than what I'm used to seeing, eyes more downcast than what I'm used to seeing, that I would be probably afraid of them. And I would mistake their desperation for something else. So I would have been wrong about that. And I'm not saying that with shame. There are a lot of understandable reasons for all that. I'm just mentioning that that's what I noticed going on in myself as I watched all this going on. And my overwhelming feeling that there was absolutely no justice in what was happening before me, as 70 people got up and each life changed in about 20 seconds. I know that the attorneys involved often have compassion. They want to get them in and out of there. But it's crazy to think that there's any kind of justice going on here. These people are so obviously desperate, so disempowered, so clearly broken, and so completely despised. So I came away feeling like there's a better way. This is a part of our system that is absolutely broken. And I also keep in mind that this new form of deterrence is not working. The forces of migration are extreme. They are systems of inequality and violence and brutality are the primary reasons, but I also have to acknowledge that our country is not without fault. We did NAFTA, and we also tend to prop up those in other countries who are authoritarian and dictators and who are aiming for the friendliest business policies that can occur with the U.S. And that all goes into creating all of this. So while this system is not deterring anyone, it's also, meanwhile, making a lot of U.S. businesses a hell of a lot of money. From the AmericanCouncil.org, the expansion of criminal enforcement against migrants comes at great financial expense to the U.S. taxpayer. One conservative estimate for the incarceration of defendants charged with or convicted of entry-related offenses totaled $7 billion in the decade between 2005 and 2015. And of course, now we've seen such a ratcheting up of this. Estimates of other court-related costs include appointed public defenders and judicial resources, administrative costs, millions and millions of dollars every month. And most of that's going to private prisons like Core Civic and the GEO Group, who also run the detention centers. So the latest numbers I read from the New York Times indicates this is a $4 billion industry, and that 73% of immigrants in the detention system are handled by such private industry. It just felt like everyone has figured out a way to exploit these people for money or for something, and they are the least empowered in their own lives. So a lot of feelings were felt. Of course, what I do and what we're doing as a group is to go into those painful places and educate ourselves and feel our feelings, and then take steps to educate and take action from there. So thank you so much for having us here.
Well, my job is to tell you about the Benedictine Monastery shelter. And this is a lot more upbeat, I promise. There are so many moments that really touched me in the days that we were in this seminar. But I think nothing moved me so much as the Benedictine Monastery. The building itself just looks like a big oasis. It's quite an impressive kind of colonial style, it's kind of like a mission kind of out in the east part of Tucson. When we got there in the middle of the afternoon on Friday, a little frazzled after all that we'd done already, we parked kind of in the back and walked in the back past a big loading dock. And on that dock, there were piles and piles of stuff. Like paper towels and clothing and toys and all sorts of stuff. We met Dell there in the back, and it was at dinner time, and she told us that there were more than 200 people in residence at that particular time. This building was a Benedictine monastery for nuns, but they aged out, and the building was sold about a year ago, and the owner of the building has plans to make it into posh apartments and restaurants, and you know the drill. But he's generously donated the space and the utilities, and I assume the insurance, to make this into a shelter for people who are coming into the country and asking for asylum. The people that we saw there have all been processed by immigration, and they're in between being incarcerated in various forms and going to sponsors. So they come to this shelter to get oriented and get taken care of health-wise in every other way. They stay usually for about 3 days. And everything in this monastery is donated. Volunteer time, everything. Think about it for a minute. There's a capacity of 350 people in this building. Think of how much food it takes to feed that many people 3 times a day. Think about how much shampoo you'd need, keeping in mind these people haven't had a shower for maybe months even. I mean, et cetera, et cetera. It's just mind-blowing, and all of it is donated. And a whole army of volunteers come to do laundry, they come to cook, they come to clean, they come to do everything. We were really impressed that as we walked by people, some of them eating their dinner in the hallway because the dining room was full, they always looked at us and wished us buenas tardes and smiled at us. These people did not look like criminals, and they did not act like scammers. And there was one little girl who had about 10 braids, all of which were tied in white ribbons. This little girl came trotting by us as we were listening to Dell's presentation, and she stopped right beside Mary and just looked at us and smiled at us, and pretty soon she hops off and she comes back with a stuffed animal and clearly wants us to admire her newly acquired stuffed animal. All the kids get a new stuffed animal. And I couldn't help but wonder what Trump would think if he were sitting there. Could he have said the things he said that very morning about asylum seekers? And you know what he said. You know, he keeps saying it. I was so touched by this place that I went back to Borderlinks and I wrote this poem I want to share with you this morning. April 5th, 2019. No nuns sleep in this monastery now. Children frolic and laugh in the halls, clutching stuffed animals, while parents speak in soft tones, organizing their new lives. 350 can sleep here. These are the caravan people who walked for weeks wearing out their shoes, striving for a better life, or even life itself. These are the people we saw in those pictures of crowds sleeping in the rain under the bridge in El Paso in a chicken wire cage. Hundreds of volunteers come here every single day, offering the communion of food and clothes and safety. Love lives here in this place of welcoming smiles. It is a place of hope for immigrants and for the soul of our country.
So throughout the service, you've been introduced to some of the stories and experiences that we had, and every time our response was, this is so, so wrong. No human being, regardless, should be treated this way. But if not this, then what? How do we keep our borders secure while at the same time treating those in need with grace? That's the question. Policies reflect the true nature, the core values, the heart of a country. And our current policies are cruel, unjust, and inhumane. In a word, morally corrupt. There's no way I can do justice to the topic of immigration policy, as it is very complicated and different policies address different immigration situations. But hopefully, you will get the gist of the problem and perhaps hear a policy suggestion that spurs your interest so that you will want to explore it further. As mentioned, we learned that situations for immigrants differ. There are those that are crossing the border without proper documentation. There are those that are seeking asylum. There are those that are undocumented but have been living in the U.S. for years. There are those that were brought here as children of undocumented immigrants and have grown up here. And more recently, Trump added those that were born here but whose parents are undocumented. Of course, an immediate response, and a good one, is to pledge, one, to become more deeply informed, more educated about immigration issues, and to advocate for policy change. And two, to provide much-needed resources to the humanitarian organizations that are working every day to meet the vast needs of immigrants. But the disturbing and heartbreaking circumstances of the immigrants we saw are the consequences of our current immigration policies. So, while we were there, we asked those working closely with immigrants, what changes in policy would they recommend, did they think would contribute to a more humane and effective immigration system? And the answers were amazingly consistent. So here they are, and I'm going to keep them short because I know we're going a little bit over time here. One, create a viable and sustainable guest worker program that allows for a 3 to 5 year renewable work visa. One idea we heard was this, that immigrants often sell their homes, their farms, they sell their personal belongings to raise the money that they pay the coyotes to bring them across the border, somewhere between $4,000 to $6,000 usually, and it's everything they own. And then instead of doing that, have them invest that money in a work program. So they'd give the money to the government. They would be able to recollect that money when they go back home, maybe with interest. It was just one idea we heard that we thought made some good sense. That would provide the U.S. employers with the help they needed. That would encourage migrants to use dedicated border crossings instead of trying to cross through the desert. It would eliminate the need for paying coyotes and drug cartels, and it would reduce the need for and cost of intense border security. Number two, expedite the asylum hearings by increasing immigration personnel at the border. Currently, asylum seekers must be in the U.S. to apply. Due to the volume of applications, asylum seekers have to wait months, sometimes years, for their case to be reviewed. In the meantime, they can't work. They're dependent on sponsors for a place to stay, for food, and many, about 65%, are eventually deported in the end. So they wait, and they're sent home. With more personnel, the wait could be reduced significantly. Stop the criminalization of those crossing the border without authorization. Charging immigrants with a criminal violation is intended as a deterrent, and as said earlier, it's not working. So instead, quit that and change that policy. The last three, I'll just discuss briefly. Number four, grant undocumented immigrants who have families, homes, and jobs in the U.S. some sort of legal status. Reinstate DACA. It's kind of in a wobbly situation. And most complicated but essential, number six, provide aid to help improve living conditions in South American countries so that there is incentives to stay in the home country rather than leave. So in closing, policies speak louder than words. What should they say about our morals, our values as individuals, and as a nation?